everyone, and welcome to the 9th edition of the Edible Cities Network Global Lunch Talks. Today, we'll be talking about urban beekeeping and the benefits of pollinators in our cities. And we have here with us Martin Stelter from Stadtbienen and Steve Rogenstein from the Ambeessadors. I see a lot of familiar faces, but also happy to see new people joining us today. Names more like it. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Mill. I'm a physical geographer, and I have been working for the Edible Cities Network project since September 2020. Before I give the word to our panelists today, I would like to give you a brief introduction of the Edible Cities Network project, and after their presentations, there's going to be a Q&A session where you're welcome to either directly pose your questions by raising your hand in Zoom or writing them down in the chat. So the Edible Cities Network project is a 5-year project funded by the EU within the Horizon 2020 project. However, it was extended until February 2024. It is an innovation action project, which means that there's a lot of hands-on work and it needs to produce tangible results. It is divided in 8 work packages and coordinated projects. And there are 35 international partner organizations and approximately 100 individuals funded by the project, myself included. So what is the project's mission? It is to mainstream edible city solutions for more socially inclusive, sustainably productive, biodiversity-friendly, resilient, and healthy cities. What are edible city solutions? Edible city solutions are a type of natural-based solutions that include a wide range of different forms of urban farming, food production, distribution, and consumption. Here, I want to underline that edible city solutions are not just urban gardens, but they can be also any kind of high-tech solutions such as aquaponics or hydroponics, green facades, or even urban beekeeping, as we're going to see today. Edible city solutions are combined with closed-loop systems for sustainable water, nutrient, and waste management, and measures to foster urban biodiversity, and they use innovative principles of ecological design and closed material and energy flows. The positive thing about edible city solutions is that they overcome the mismatch between regular natural-based solutions and citizens by deepening the social dimension of natural-based solutions. And within our project, what we're trying to do is to mainstream the successful co-creation practice of edible city solutions that are socially inclusive and invite citizens to co-create the sustainable development of their society, to proactively change the urban environment to their benefit, and to induce a paradigm shift of lifestyle. We do this through what we call the co-creative communities of knowledge and practice. These are basically our 13 different city teams. So as you can see here on the right, they're located all over the globe. And the city teams are working groups with actors of all levels, meaning city administrators, planners, members of local NGOs and businesses, but also citizens themselves. They're open and participatory, and they facilitate a collective learning process that leads to a comprehensive and co-developed knowledge base with contributions from theoretical and practical contexts. So within the project, we divide our cities into frontrunner and follower cities. And the different city teams in these cities have different goals. So the city teams in frontrunner cities are developing and testing on the ground edible city solutions in 6 living labs, whereas the city teams in follower cities are developing urban master plans that aim at upscaling and mainstreaming edible city solutions in the long run, and always using the knowledge gathered from the living labs in frontrunner cities. Now diving a little bit more into the topic of today. So why biodiversity-friendly and edible cities? Well, biodiversity supports the provision of ecosystem services, and if you want to produce food in the city, as we're going to see later, pollinators are necessary for any crop we want to grow. Biodiversity also makes us happy, and it supports public and planetary health. And it's important to support it where we live and work, meaning in cities as well. When we talk about biodiversity, it is important to distinguish between actual and perceived biodiversity. So actual biodiversity is measured by various tools of ecological research, and it's probably what we all think of when we hear the term biodiversity. Whereas perceived biodiversity is how us as individuals experience our environment and everything that surrounds us, the species richness, and how that affects us. Of course, these two terms are dependent and affect each other, but there hasn't been that much research done on the topic. As a matter of fact, within our research group, we just started a new project, which is kind of a continuation of the Edible Cities Network project, but dives deeper into the biodiversity part of them. It is called Healthy and Biodiverse Edible Cities, and is a cluster randomized controlled trial to assess the effects of a biodiversity-focused community gardening intervention on species richness and health in adults. The project is funded by the German Federal Ministry of Education and Research, and we will be partnering with the Public Health Department of the University of Heidelberg, as well as our current partners now in EdiCitNet, Mondrau, Prinzessinnengarten, and UCA. Having said that, I want to invite you all to join the Edible Cities Network, so you won't miss any future events we organize and might be of your interest, and you can also follow us on social media. You can find the links for that in the chat. And this was just a very brief introduction. I don't want to waste the time of our panelists, and I'm going to give the word now to Steve Rogenstein.
Thank you, Eddie, for that introduction. You guys are doing obviously great work, and I'm kind of honored to be here and talk about bees and pollinators in the city. Just briefly, I founded the Ambeessadors, and we have a dual mission of connecting the bee community and educating the public about the importance of bees and pollinators. And we do this through research, events, educational programs, advocacy, and more. Today I'm going to talk about specifically bees in the city, pollinators in the city, a case study in Berlin, and some other things that will hopefully educate you. So I was speaking at a conference many years ago, and afterwards a Danish beekeeper came up to me and said, "It's not about the bees." And I was thinking, I don't really understand what that means. For me, it is about bees. They're dying, and I want to do my part to save them. And it took years to finally understand what he meant. And honeybees specifically are a gateway species in that they represent the 20,000 bees that are out there and the 350,000 pollinators that include bees and butterflies and birds and bats and others. And they're super important. But after, and also beyond the pollinators, they're connecting us deeper into nature. And after 12 years working with bees, I finally am hyper aware of my surroundings. I notice when the bees and the pollinators, what kind of bees are visiting the flowers, what flowers are in bloom when, what trees are flowering, if they're not, if there are bees attracted to them. And it's because of this that I know where my food comes from. I'm connected to seasonality, to changes in temperature and weather and precipitation, and all of this I owe to being more connected to the bees. So now I'm going to talk about pollinators and why they're important. Here's breakfast. It's a typical breakfast in the United States. It's scrambled eggs and fruit salad with toast with jam and fruit juice and coffee with milk and maybe a little side dish of granola with some nuts and fruit. This is with pollination and pollinators. And this is without. Very boring. You have no fruits. You have no almonds. You have not even milk, because the cows are feeding off of hay and alfalfa, which are pollinated by bees. So 70 of the 100 most consumed foods depend on pollinators, and they say that 1/3 of everything that we eat has been pollinated by a bee. So if you like citrus and berries and squashes and many of your vegetables and herbs and the milk and the meat that you eat, you owe it to pollinators, and especially bees. So they're pollinating about 70% of our food crops, about 35% of the agricultural land out there, and astounding 90% of flowering plants. Bees have been on the planet for about 100 million years, and they have co-evolved with the plants, the greenery around us. And they are basically responsible for pretty much everything that you see that's out there being green. They are producing our food and the food for animals, and they also are food. We have a lot of birds and lizards and frogs that are eating insects. So this is a whole food chain, and we're all part of it. So let's visit some bees. As we see, there's lots of variety of bees and colors and sizes and shapes with long tongues and short tongues, and there are 20,000 species of bees out there. And the honeybees are just 7 species of these. And the majority, well, 10% are social. You have bumblebees and mellifera bees that are social. And then you have solitary bees. And solitary means that they basically live alone. They have a life cycle that's alone. You have queens that are laying eggs, provisioning it with nectar and honey, nectar and pollen. And then the queens die, and you have a new generation that comes the following season. Sorry, my slide's not advancing. So let's just jump to pollinators in the cities. So it's surprising to some that there's greater diversity of pollinators in many cities. And the reasoning is because in rural areas, they're often agricultural monocultures, meaning there's like one crop that's being grown. You don't have the biodiversity because there are no flower strips. There aren't grasslands where lots of pollinators are living. They're being sprayed with pesticides. There's an interesting study that's being done by Best Bees, and they are doing honey DNA. They're taking genetic sampling of what is in the honey. And in rural areas, they have, on average in the United States, 150 plant species. In comparison, in suburbia, where you have lots of lawns, which are kind of like food deserts, you have about 100 plant species. And then in the cities, what they're showing is that there are about 225 different plant species. And for example, in Boston alone, they have 8 times as many plant species in their honey as in the rural areas surrounding Boston. So what do pollinators need in cities? They need a chemical-free environment. They need an array of native flowers, especially. You have other cultivar flowers that are, bought at nurseries that are not native. These provide nectar and food, but these are for the very generalist pollinator species, and not necessarily for the ones that have co-evolved to, like monarch butterflies. They live and feed off of milkweed, for example. So what's really important is that we have a variety of the native flowers at the beginning of the season and at the end of the growing season. And trees especially are a good source of food and some habitat as well. Safe nesting habitats. So when you're, in the fall cleaning out your garden, you might want to leave some stalks because they bore holes in there and they lay the eggs, and that's where the next generation of pollinators might be living. And the connectivity between these habitats so that you have the movement of insect populations. And of course, water sources, because water is the basis of life. So there's lots of innovations that are happening to encourage habitat, for instance, insect hotels. I specifically included this example in a hotel rooftop in London because it's a bad example. What they're now discovering is that these very large insect hotels can spread diseases very easily. So what they're recommending is that you downsize and maybe do one of those hexagons in an area. In Bristol and Brighton and other places in the UK, they have passed laws that require new buildings to include these bee bricks, which provide habitat for many of these pollinator species. In terms of forage, in Utrecht and other places around the world, they're putting green roofs on bus stops. It's just area of city space that's perfect for pollinators, a kind of stopping place to forage and eat on sedum and other plant species. There's a new movement called No Mow May. And in May, if you leave your lawn, you've got things like dandelions that will grow up and provide early spring blossoms and food for pollinators. And then a lot of departments of transportation are planting pollinator highways along the sides of roads and encouraging, the food and the forage and the habitat for the pollinators, as well as these corridors that connect them and provide, movement of insects. And a lot of community programs as well. You have Bee City and Bee Campus in the United States and Canada, whereby entire towns are dedicating themselves to pollinator-friendly habitats. They're not doing pesticide spraying as much, and really encouraging citizens to get involved and get aware as to what do the bees and the pollinators need. And there are citizen science projects that abound. This one's the Great Sunflower Project. There's others that track monarch butterfly migrations and milkweed plantings and gardens everywhere. And I'm involved in one called Honeybee Watch. And specifically, what we're going to do is go to Prinzessinnengarten. It's a Edible Cities Living Lab in Berlin. And I'm not personally involved with them. However, I work with one of their partners, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. But I grabbed this from their website. They garden in raised beds, offer workshops on ecological do-it-yourself projects. They operate a large environmental education area, and they're involved in the cultural program of their neighborhood, Neukölln. And they do everything from provide events for gardening days or plant and seed exchanges. They have a, right here, what we see is a farm shop and a garden shop and a cafe and other things. They have a studio that's nearby that the community can use, and it's an educational location for environmental studies, et cetera, et cetera. And they also have natural beekeeping. So actually, oops, I preempted myself there. So Mellifera Berlin is in charge of the beekeeping program there. It's an organization in Berlin that is dedicated to natural beekeeping, like Stadtbienen. They are one branch in a national organization, mellifera, in Germany. And they have educational programs. They do workshops with beekeeping courses, things for kids, apiary tours. They were involved with producing the Learning from the Bees conference that I was also involved in. They host monthly meetings, and we're also talking about starting a honey festival in Berlin. And they set up in Prinzessinnengarten a few years ago because they were evicted from a prior location in the center of Berlin due to development. So they've actually moved into a 7-hectare former cemetery, actually partial cemetery, and partial education center. And what they've set up is an apiary with various types of hives, all of which are on the spectrum of natural. So what you have here is a Klotzblüte, a log hive. And this is from the Middle Ages. Basically, in Russia, they have been preserving this for 1,000 years, where they're taking a log, and they're carving it out and creating species-appropriate habitat for honeybees. And it's a way to basically hoist it into a tree or put it on stilts and allow the bees to move in and have thick-walled insulation and not much manipulation. It's not really about honey harvest. It's really about letting the bees be. You have right here, I don't know if you can see my cursor, it's called an Anräumblüte. It's a one-room hive, and it's like a Langstroth, which is the boxes that you typically see in beekeeping, but it's one room. And it's basically not stacked up, it's horizontal, and you can separate the area so that there's space to grow the hive. And then you have a top bar hive, which is very common in Africa. They're called a Kenyan top bar hive. And this is using materials that are very local, very affordable. And what you do is you put bars on the top and you let the bees create the foundation themselves. This is a sun hive, and it's an example of a hybrid that connects the old skep hives, which were the kind of woven hives that you used to have in kind of the Middle Ages and early 1800s. And inside are actually removable frames. So you have this combination of the two, the best of both worlds. And then a ware hive, which was built in the late 1800s as a reaction to the Langstroth hive. Basically, you don't need to visit and inspect these bees very often. You can let them be. You don't put supers on the top, you put them on the bottom. You have observation windows, and it's a way to be more natural with your hives. I was going to go into a whole bunch of slides about the state of the bees. Maybe you've heard that they're dying at an alarming rate. And this is due to a lot of factors such as invasive species that are coming from other areas and challenging the bees. You have diseases, you have monocultures, you have the suppression of swarming and other traits that they're breeding out of the bees. And it's concerning. And hopefully Martin's going to talk about the state of beekeeping specifically in Berlin and Stadtbienen. So that's my presentation for now. If you want more information about what we're doing, you can find us at the Ambeessadors on Facebook and on Instagram, and Honeybee Watch, if you wouldn't mind putting that in the chat, is a citizen science project whereby we're trying to learn more about naturally living honeybees, which we call free living, that are around the world, and you can participate very easily. So thank you. That's my presentation.
Thank you very much, Steve. I will take over. That was a very great overview already about different aspects of beekeeping and different aspects that you have to have a look at when you dedicate yourself to bees and to honeybees. I want to give you an overview about what we are doing. Just give me a second to share my screen. So I brought you a very brief overview about Stadtbienen, and I will touch on some topics. So first of all, thank you very much for having me. My name is Martin. I'm the managing director of Stadtbienen, City Bees in English. And what we actually do is we are a nonprofit organization that has been founded already in 2014. So we're almost like 10 years old. And we are 18 employees here sitting in Berlin. That's our core team. But we have more than 80 experts, mainly beekeepers that work with us across Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. And we do beekeeping projects or projects around bees, you could say, all across Germany and always in urban areas. And what we do in a nutshell is actually, how I like to summarize is we do good and teach about it. That also has been recognized by the UNESCO program, Education for Sustainable Development, Implementing Global Sustainability Goals. I am obliged to say that full title when I talk about the UNESCO, that's why I mentioned it. Yeah, but what do I mean by do good and teach about it? And let's maybe go back to when we founded Stadtbienen almost 10 years ago. Steve already mentioned that the population of bees, well, actually, especially 10 years ago, was declining in Germany, all across Europe. And he also mentioned already that the city is actually a very good ecosystem for bees because we have a wide range of flowers. We have some flowers that bloom in April and March, April. We have flowers that bloom in June, July, and then we have some late bloomers, you could say, that bloom in September, October. So the bees actually, they find nutrition almost all across the year, and it's and many different kind of nutrition. So it's already a very diverse, biodiverse ecosystem that's actually suitable for honeybees. And 10 years ago, when the decline of honeybee population was in mainstream media, it was a widespread topic that has been discussed about. Johannes, the founder of Stadtbienen, had the idea to foster urban beekeeping. And he did that by coming up with also with a one-room hive. We call it Bienenbox, bee box, you could say in English. That is quite easy when you start beekeeping. It's easy to maintain, it's easy to operate, but it's also easy to learn about the bees because we have some features that are very easy for observing bees, for instance, and getting to know the status of your bees. So he came up with this bean box, with this bee box 10 years ago. And he also came up with a course, a 1-year course that always starts in April, May and runs for 1 year. So it ends in April next year. And that walks through all the important steps of beekeeping that you need to know. So you learn about how to actually get your first bees. You learn how you include them or actually settle them down in the bean box, but also what you have to do in order to keep the bees healthy, what you have to do during winter time, for instance, what you have to do when you want to extract honey, and then so on and so forth. So it teaches you all the necessary steps to do beekeeping. But it's only the first year. We always say this is only a start when you actually start the hobby of beekeeping. It's something where you always have to learn and learn and learn. There will things happen in the second year, in the third year, that didn't appear in the first year, and that is also connected to the environment. You might have years where it rains more. You have years where it's drier, and then you have to react differently. And you will also see that your beehive is actually developing in a different way. But anyways, the way how we teach the beekeeping is also on the so-called natural spectrum. It's a healthy way, means it's healthier for the bees because we leave enough honey in the hive for winter. We don't take all the honey out that usually beekeepers do. The regular beekeepers leave enough honey so that the bees can survive over winter. That's actually why they started collecting honey or producing honey in the first place, so that they have something to eat during winter time. And this honey also includes enzymes and other good ingredients that cater to the health of the bees. And regular beekeepers, they take all the honey out and just put a sugar solution in there. They can also survive in the sugar solution, but it's not the best actually. So we leave enough honey in the beehive for them to have enough food in wintertime. We also work along the natural bee propagation. So we work in a natural way of growing bees. For instance, we don't do any green breeding. And we also our way of beekeeping is a patient way, because we let the bees build their own honeycombs, which also has quite some positive side effects. For instance, the communication is improved in the hive. Regular beekeepers, they put in like pre-built structures where the honeybees have to build upon. That actually increases the growth, but it brings some problems. For instance, as I said, for the communication. We actually teach the beekeeping in our annual course, but not just there. We work with many different target groups. We work, for instance, in Berlin, we have meetups where we invite people. We have many different backgrounds. People who just came to Berlin or came to Germany, refugees, for instance, people who live here for a longer time. We have people who have a higher income, people who have a lower income. We have young folks, we have old folks. And here, for instance, I have some pictures from a school class. We also bring beekeeping to primary schools. We help the schools to found bee meetups at their own schools. We bring all the material, we educate the teachers, and then the teachers educate the schools, the little kids, not just in completely beekeeping, but in some aspects of beekeeping. And we do that because beekeeping also connects you to your environment in a totally different way. It connects you to your city, actually. When you look at the bees, I think I mentioned already earlier, you see not just how the bees are doing, but you also see how the environment is doing. Are they flying out today or not? Did they grow fast in the last months or not? Did they collect a lot of honey this year or didn't they? And by observing that, you also get an intuitive feeling actually for your environment, for the vicinity, for your neighborhood, and how the nature is doing in your neighborhood. And that's why we try to bring beekeeping to many different groups of the city, not just to propagate or not just to make everybody start beekeeping, but also to be connected to the nature and to use that as a tool for a better understanding of the ecosystem that you're living in. So urban beekeeping for us is a hobby with purpose. It's, you know, you can have a dog, you can have a cat, you can have fish, whatever. But if you have bees as a pet, you're doing good for the local biodiversity, because every bee pollinates certain flowers, and once it goes from one flower to another flower, it brings the gene from one flower to another flower. Well, I don't have to explain you all that. You probably know it, and Steve already touched on that area. And as I also said, it's a good indicator on the local climate and biodiversity, but it's also Zen time for you. I mean, you can meditate, but you can also start beekeeping, because when you stand in front of the beehive, you get calm. You have to be calm, and the bees actually they bring you down. You have to move slowly, and yeah, it's a good way to relax. And also, local honey helps with hay fever, because it includes the pollen from the vicinity, and you might be allergic to that in springtime, for instance. When you eat the honey, when you eat the local honey, actually, you eat some of these pollen, and that helps you with the immunization. And in the end, it helps you with the hay fever that you might have in springtime. But what we also do, I think I touched on that already, we don't just do the urban beekeeping for the sake of urban beekeeping. We actually do it because we want to look on the bigger picture. And that's also the reason why we talk to all the many different target groups. We don't just have to look, actually, when we started Stadtbienen 10 years ago, we only focused on the honeybees. Now, for like 2 or 3 years, we also include the wild bees. We transform green spaces into biodiverse spaces within the city, for instance. But we widened our view, actually, and we looked at the bigger picture. What we actually need are healthy ecosystems. And the bees are just like one solution in that, or can be one solution. So once you look on one solution, you also have to connect it to the other solutions. And I think here in the Edible Cities Network, for instance, we mentioned it already, bees, they're pollinators. You need pollination to produce food, to produce, to grow the tomatoes and to grow the strawberries. And you have to include all that. For instance, when you want to start beekeeping, or when you, for instance, build a garden, build it holistically. Try to include the bees, but also try to include other insects. Try to include many local plants as much as possible, because, as I said, you have to look at the bigger picture. Otherwise, if you don't do so, you just try to get enough space for your own project. And if we had that, not we, but the community of beekeepers already had the problem that, if you bring too many honeybees in the city, that can be a problem for wild bees, for instance, other insects, because they take too much space and too much nutrition from the wild bees. And that should not be the case. In our urban beekeeping course, we always teach the people also to have a look at how much environment, how much possible nutrition is in the vicinity, and is there still space to introduce honeybees in the neighborhood or not. So you always have to include, as I said, you always have to include yourself in that bigger picture and that aim to build a healthy ecosystem. And we do that actually, or that actually is the reason why we not just do the urban beekeeping, but the reason why we also do these bee meetups in Berlin, why we have online live sessions, why we have live streams and so on, to reach out to as many target groups as possible and to sensitize them for the bigger ecological problems by talking about bees, but not just the bees. And as I said, in the end, we need enough habitat for every native species. When we transform green spaces, for instance, for bees, we not just transform them for the bees, but also for moths, for instance, for butterflies, as well for birds. And as I said, you have to include them in the picture in order to have a healthy ecosystem. And that's in the end, our aim that we're looking for is we want to build a city that is possibly the best ecosystem that we have. And their beekeeping is one brick in that, you could say. Okay, I think I touched enough topics. Thank you very much, guys.